The story of the United Kingdom begins long before there were kings, queens, or even the idea of a nation. It begins in a time when the land that would become Britain was wild, untamed, and shaped by the forces of nature. Millions of years ago, the islands that make up the United Kingdom were not islands at all, but part of a vast continent. Over countless ages, the land shifted, seas rose and fell, and glaciers carved valleys and hills. The climate changed again and again, sometimes warm and lush, sometimes cold and covered in ice. The land was home to mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and saber-toothed cats. It was a place of forests, rivers, and open plains, a land waiting for people to arrive. The first humans came to Britain more than 800,000 years ago, during a warm period when the land was connected to Europe by a wide plain known as Doggerland. These early people were hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, following herds of animals, and gathering wild plants. They made simple stone tools, built temporary shelters, and left behind only the faintest traces of their lives: flint, hand axes, animal bones, and footprints preserved in ancient mud. As the climate cooled and the ice returned, people were forced to leave, and for long periods, Britain was empty of human life. But each time the ice retreated, people returned, bringing new skills, new tools, and new ways of living. Around 40,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in Britain. They were skilled hunters and artists, able to survive in harsh conditions. They hunted mammoths, reindeer, and wild horses, and they painted images of animals on the walls of caves. They made jewelry from animal teeth and shells, and they buried their dead with care and ceremony. These people lived in small bands, moving from place to place, always adapting to the changing world around them. The end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, brought dramatic changes to Britain. The climate warmed, forests spread across the land, and the great herds of Ice Age animals disappeared. People adapted by hunting smaller animals, fishing in rivers and lakes, and gathering nuts, berries, and roots from the forests. They made new kinds of tools, microliths, tiny blades set into wooden handles, and they began to settle in more permanent camps. As the ice melted, the sea levels rose, and the land bridge to Europe was slowly swallowed by the waves. By around 6000 BC, Britain had become an island, separated from the continent by the waters of the North Sea and the English Channel. This isolation would shape the history of the islands for thousands of years to come. The people of Mesolithic Britain were still hunter-gatherers, but they were becoming more settled. They built wooden houses, dug pits to store food, and created middens, huge piles of shells and bones that marked their campsites. They made canoes from hollowed-out logs and traveled along rivers and coasts, trading with other groups and exploring new lands. Around 4000 BC, a new way of life arrived in Britain, the Neolithic Revolution. People from the continent brought with them the secrets of farming, pottery, and weaving. They cleared forests to make fields, planted wheat and barley, and raised cattle, sheep, and pigs. They built permanent villages with houses made of wood, stone, and clay. They made pottery for cooking and storage, and they wove cloth from plant fibers and animal wool. The Neolithic farmers changed the landscape of Britain forever. They built monuments of earth and stone-long barrows for their dead, causewayed enclosures for gatherings and rituals, and great stone circles that still stand today. The most famous of these is Stonehenge, a mysterious ring of massive stones on the Salisbury Plain. No one knows exactly why Stonehenge was built, but it was clearly a place of great importance, a center for ceremony, gathering, and perhaps even astronomy. The people of Neolithic Britain lived in small communities, working together to farm the land, raise animals, and build their monuments. They traded with distant groups, exchanging flint, pottery, and precious stones. They honored their ancestors and the spirits of the land, and they developed new skills in building, art, and technology. Around 2500 BC, a new wave of people arrived in Britain, bringing with them the secrets of metalworking. These were the Beaker people, named for their distinctive pottery. They introduced copper and gold, and later bronze, changing the tools, weapons, and jewelry of the islands. The Bronze Age brought new ways of living, new forms of art, and new kinds of monuments, round barrows, stone circles, and hill forts taught the people of Bronze Age Britain were skilled metalworkers, farmers, and traders. They built villages on hilltops and in valleys, and they traveled by land and sea to trade with Ireland, France, and beyond. They buried their dead with care, sometimes in individual graves with rich offerings of weapons, jewelry, and pottery. The Bronze Age was a time of innovation and connection, but also of conflict and change. As the centuries passed, new groups arrived, bringing new ideas and new challenges. The story of Britain was just beginning, and the land would see many more waves of people, each leaving their mark on the history of the islands. As the Bronze Age dawned in Britain, the land was alive with change and innovation. The people who lived here were no longer just hunter-gatherers or simple farmers. They were skilled metalworkers, builders, and traders. The arrival of bronze, an alloy of copper, and tin transformed daily life. Tools became sharper and more durable, weapons more deadly, and jewelry more beautiful. The people of Bronze Age Britain built round barrows for their dead, raised to standing stones, and constructed great monuments that still inspire awe today. One of the most mysterious and iconic of these monuments is Stonehenge. Rising from the flat plains of southern England, Stonehenge is a circle of massive stones, some weighing more than 20 tons, carefully arranged in a pattern that aligns with the movements of the sun. The construction of Stonehenge began around 3000 BC and continued for more than 1,000 years. The people who built it transported the stones over great distances, using only simple tools, ropes, and wooden sledges. No one knows for certain why Stonehenge was built. Some believe it was a temple to the sun or moon, a place for rituals and ceremonies, or an ancient calendar to mark the changing seasons. Others think it was a burial ground, a gathering place for distant tribes, or a center for healing and pilgrimage. Whatever its purpose, Stonehenge stands as a testament to the skill, determination, and imagination of prehistoric Britons. Across the land, other stone circles, henges, and burial mounds appeared. Avery, with its vast ring of stones, and Silbury Hill, the largest man-made mound in Europe, are just two examples of the monumental landscape created by the people of ancient Britain. These sites were centers of community, ceremony, and connection to the land and the ancestors. The Bronze Age people lived in small villages, often on hilltops or near rivers. Their houses were round, made of wood and thatch, with a central hearth for cooking and warmth. They farmed the land, growing wheat and barley, and raised cattle, sheep, and pigs. They hunted deer and wild boar, fished in rivers and lakes, and gathered wild fruits and nuts. Trade was important, and goods such as bronze, gold, amber, and pottery traveled across Britain and beyond. The people of the Bronze Age were connected to Ireland, France, and even the distant Mediterranean. They exchanged not only goods, but also ideas, art, and technology. As the centuries passed, new groups arrived in Britain, bringing new customs and beliefs. Around 800 BC, the Iron Age began. Iron tools and weapons were stronger and more effective. Then bronze, and the people who mastered iron gained power and influence. The Iron Age saw the rise of the Celtic tribes, who would shape the culture and identity of Britain for centuries. The Celts were a diverse and dynamic people, united by language, art, and religion. They lived in tribes, each with its own chief, warriors, and druids, the priests and wise men who kept the traditions and knowledge of the people. The Celts built hill forts for defense, with massive earthworks and wooden palisades. Some of these forts, like Magna Castle and Danebury, became centers of power and trade. Celtic society was organized around kinship and loyalty. Families and clans worked together to farm the land, raise animals, and defend their territory. Warriors were respected for their courage and skill in battle, and feasting, music, and storytelling were central to Celtic life. The Celts were skilled metalworkers, creating intricate jewelry, weapons, and tools decorated with swirling patterns and animal motifs. They believed in many gods and goddesses, each associated with natural forces, rivers, forests, and the sky. Sacred groves, springs, and rivers were places of worship, and offerings of weapons, jewelry, and food were made to the spirits. The Druids played a central role in Celtic religion, leading rituals, teaching the young, and serving as judges and advisors. The Celts had no written language of their own, but their stories, laws, and traditions were passed down orally from generation to generation. Bards and poets kept the memory of the people alive, singing of heroes, battles, and the deeds of the gods. The Celts were also great traders and travelers. They built roads and bridges, sailed along the coasts, and traded with distant lands. Salt, tin, and iron were valuable commodities, and Celtic goods have been found as far away as Greece and Italy. Life in Iron Age, Britain was not always peaceful. Tribes competed for land and resources, and warfare was common. Hill forts were attacked and defended. Alliances made and broken, and chiefs rose and fell. Yet, despite the conflicts, the Celts created a vibrant and enduring culture. Their art, music, and beliefs would leave a lasting mark on the history of Britain. By the time the Romans first looked across the Channel at the misty shores of Britain, the land was home to dozens of Celtic tribes, each with its own identity, traditions, and leaders. The stage was set for a new chapter in the story of the islands, a chapter that would bring conquest, change, and the birth of a new nation. For centuries, the Celtic tribes of Britain lived in the land of forests, hills, and rivers, building forts, farming the land, and honoring their gods in sacred groves and springs. But across the sea, a new power was rising, a power that would change the history of Britain forever. The Romans, masters of the Mediterranean world, looked north to the misty island they called Britannia. They saw a land of riches, tin, gold, and fertile fields, but also a land of fierce warriors and mysterious customs. The first contact between Rome and Britain came not with armies, but with traders and explorers. Roman goods, wine, pottery, jewelry found their way into the hands of Celtic chiefs, and stories of the Roman Empire's wealth and power spread across the land. Some Celtic leaders welcomed the new connections, hoping to gain prestige and advantage over their rivals. Others viewed the Romans with suspicion and feared. In 55 and 54 BC, Julius Caesar, the great Roman general, led 2 expeditions to Britain. He fought battles, made alliances, and claimed victory, but he did not stay. The Romans withdrew, and for nearly a century, Britain remained beyond the reach of the empire. But the idea of conquest was never forgotten. In AD 43, the Roman Emperor Claudius launched a full-scale invasion of Britain, Roman legions landed on the southern coast, marching inland with discipline and determination. The Celts fought bravely, but the Roman army was a machine of war, well-trained, well-equipped, and relentless. One by one, the tribes were defeated, their leaders captured or killed, their hill forts burned and abandoned. The Romans brought with them a new way of life. They built roads, towns, and cities, places like Londinium, Camulodunum, and Veronium. They constructed villas, bathhouses, temples, and amphitheaters. The landscape of Britain was transformed as forests were cleared, fields were plowed, and stone buildings rose where once there had been only wood and earth. The Romans introduced new crops, new animals, and new technologies. They brought writing, coins, and the Latin language. They built a network of roads that connected the farthest corners of the province, making travel and trade easier than ever before. Roman law and order replaced the old tribal customs, and the emperor's authority reached even the most remote villages. But Roman rule was not always welcomed. Many Britons resented the loss of their freedom, the burden of taxes, and the presence of foreign soldiers. Rebellion simmered beneath the surface, and in AD 60, it erupted in a storm of violence. Boudica, the queen of the Iceni tribe, led a great uprising against the Romans. Her warriors destroyed Roman towns, killed thousands of settlers, and for a time, threatened to drive the invaders from the land. The Romans responded with brutal force, crushing the rebellion and punishing those who resisted. Boudica's revolt became a legend, a symbol of courage and resistance that would inspire future generations. Despite the conflicts, Roman Britain became a place of blending and change. Many Celtic leaders adopted Roman ways, building villas, wearing togas, and sending their sons to be educated in Roman schools. Roman gods and Celtic spirits were worshipped side by side, and new religions, including Christianity, began to take root. The province prospered, its towns grew, and its people enjoyed the benefits of peace, trade, and security. The Romans built Hadrian's Wall, a massive stone barrier stretching across the north of Britain, to keep out the tribes of Scotland, the Picts and others who refused to be conquered. The wall was more than a military fortification. It was a symbol of the edge of the Roman world, a line between civilization and the wild. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Soldiers from all over the empire served. In its forts, merchants traded goods from distant lands, and people from many backgrounds lived and worked together. But the empire itself was changing. In the 3rd and 4th centuries, Rome faced new threats, barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic troubles. The legions in Britain were weakened, and the province became harder to defend. In the early 5th century, the Roman Empire began to collapse. The legions were withdrawn to fight wars closer to home, and the people of Britain were left to fend for themselves. Roman towns fell into ruin, roads crumbled, and the old ways returned. The knowledge of writing, building, and government faded, and the land entered a new age of uncertainty, yet the legacy of Rome endured. The roads, walls, and cities they built remained, shaping the landscape for centuries to come. The Latin language left its mark on English, and Roman law and customs influenced the development of British society. The memory of Rome became a source of inspiration and pride, a golden age to be remembered and, one day, restored. As the Romans departed, new peoples and new challenges awaited Britain. When the Roman legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the land was left vulnerable and uncertain. The great towns and roads of Roman Britain began to crumble, and the people who remained faced new dangers and challenges. Without the protection of Rome, the island was exposed to raids and invasions from all sides. Along the coasts, fierce warriors from Ireland, known as the Scotti, launched attacks on the western shores. From the north, the Picts descended from the wild lands of what is now Scotland, raiding villages and settlements. But the greatest threat came from across the North Sea, where new waves of invaders were gathering. These were the Anglo-Saxons, a collection of tribes from what is now Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were skilled sailors and warriors, drawn by the promise of land, wealth, and adventure. At first, they came as mercenaries, hired by local British leaders to help defend against other raiders. But soon, they began to settle, bringing their families, their customs, and their gods. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons marked the beginning of a new era in British history. Over the course of several centuries, they established their own kingdoms: Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. The native Britons were pushed westward into Wales, Cornwall, and the mountains of the north, where their languages and traditions survived. The Anglo-Saxons brought with them a new language, Old English, which would become the foundation of the English language spoken today. They built villages and farms, cleared forests, and established laws and customs that shaped the land for generations. Their society was organized around kinship and loyalty. Each kingdom was ruled by a king, advised by a council of nobles and warriors. The king's hall was the center of power, a place of feasting, storytelling, and decision-making. Warriors pledged their loyalty to their lord, and in return, they received land, weapons, and protection. The Anglo-Saxons were pagans, worshipping a pantheon of gods and goddesses. Woden, Thunder, and Ti were among the most important and sacred. Groves, springs, and stones were places of worship. Festivals marked the changing seasons, and stories of heroes, monsters, and gods were passed down through generations. But the world of the Anglo-Saxons was not isolated. Trade and contact with the continent continued, bringing new goods, ideas, and challenges. In the late 6th century, a new force arrived in Britain, the Christian missionaries. In 597, Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, landed in Kent and began the work of converting the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. The new faith spread quickly, supported by kings and queens who saw its value in uniting their people and connecting them to the wider world. Monasteries were built, becoming centers of learning, art, and culture. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved ancient knowledge, and created beautiful illuminated books, such as the Lindisfarne Gospels. The blending of Christian and pagan traditions gave rise to a unique culture, rich in art, poetry, and music. The Anglo-Saxon period was a time of both conflict and creativity. Kingdoms rose and fell, alliances were made and broken, and the land was often at war. Yet, it was also a time of great achievement. The epic poem Beowulf, written in Old English, tells the story of a hero who battles monsters and dragons, reflecting the values and fears of the age. Law codes were written, towns grew, and trade flourished. The Anglo-Saxons left a lasting mark on the landscape, with place names, churches, and burial mounds that can still be seen today. By the 8th and 9th centuries, the kingdoms of England had become powerful and prosperous. But a new threat was on the horizon. From the cold seas of the north, the Vikings were coming, fierce warriors and sailors who would challenge the Anglo-Saxon world and change the course of British history. In the 9th century, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain faced a new and terrifying threat from the north. Across the cold, stormy seas of Scandinavia, the Vikings were preparing their longships, sharpening their axes, and setting their sights on the rich and fertile lands of England. The Vikings were not a single people, but a collection of Norse warriors, traders, and settlers from what is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. They were driven by a hunger for land, wealth, and adventure, and by the traditions of their ancestors, gods like Odin and Thor, and a culture that celebrated bravery, cunning, and the glory of battle. The first recorded Viking raid on Britain came in 793, when a fleet of longships landed on the holy island of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England. The monks of Lindisfarne were taken by surprise. Their monastery was sacked, treasures stolen, and many were killed or taken as slaves. The news of the attack spread shock and fear across the land. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with horror, describing lightning, dragons in the sky, and a great famine as omens of disaster. The age of the Vikings had begun. For the next 2 centuries, the Vikings would be a constant presence in Britain. At first, they came as raiders, striking quickly along the coasts and rivers, plundering monasteries, towns, and villages, and then disappearing before local forces could respond. Their longships were marvels of design, fast, shallow-drafted, able to sail up rivers and land on any beach. The Vikings targeted the wealth of the church, knowing that monasteries held gold, silver, and precious books. But they also attacked towns, markets, and farms, taking whatever they could carry and burning what they could not. As the years passed, the Viking raids became more frequent and more ambitious. No longer content with hit-and-run attacks, the Norsemen began to overwinter in England, building camps and fortresses, and demanding tribute, known as danegeld, from local rulers. The Anglo-Saxon kings struggled to defend their lands. Some paid the Vikings to go away, others tried to fight, but the invaders kept coming. The great kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were all attacked, their rulers killed or driven into exile. In 865, a massive Viking army known as the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. Led by legendary figures such as Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ub, the army swept across the land, capturing towns and defeating Anglo-Saxon forces. The Vikings established their own territories, known as the Danelaw, covering much of northern and eastern England. In these lands, Norse law, language, and customs took root. Place names ending in by Thorpe and Thwaite still mark the Viking influence today. The Anglo-Saxons were not defeated without a fight. In the Kingdom of Wessex, a young prince named Alfred rose to prominence. Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great, was a skilled warrior, a wise leader, and a devout Christian. He fought a series of desperate battles against the Vikings, sometimes forced to retreat into the marshes and forests, but always returning to rally his people. In 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred won a decisive victory over the Viking leader Guthrum. The 2 sides made peace, dividing England between the Danelaw in the north and east, and Wessex in the south and west. Alfred's victory was not just a military triumph. It was the beginning of a cultural and political revival. He built a network of fortified towns, known as burhs, to defend against future attacks. He reorganized the army, created a navy, and promoted learning and literacy. Alfred invited scholars from across Europe to his court, translated important works into Old English, and encouraged the writing of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of the nation's history. Under Alfred and his successors, Wessex grew in strength and influence. His son Edward the Elder and daughter Ethelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, continued to fight against the Vikings, gradually reclaiming lost territories. By the early 10th century, the kings of Wessex had united much of England under their rule, though the Danelaw remained a distinct and sometimes rebellious region. The Vikings Meanwhile, were not just raiders and conquerors. Many settled in England, marrying local women, farming the land, and becoming part of the fabric of society. Norse words entered the English language, and Norse gods and legends mingled with those of the Anglo-Saxons. The Danelaw became a place of cultural fusion, where old and new ways blended together. The Viking presence in Britain was not limited to England. In Scotland, Norse settlers established powerful kingdoms in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man. In Ireland, the Vikings founded cities such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, becoming important players in the politics and trade of the region. The Norse influence can still be seen in the place names, folklore, and traditions of these lands. The struggle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings was not just a clash of arms, but a contest of cultures, religions, and identities. The Anglo-Saxons were Christians with a growing network of churches, monasteries, and bishops. The Vikings were pagans worshipping Odin, Thor, and Freya, and honoring their ancestors with feasts, sacrifices, and burial mounds. Over time, many Vikings converted to Christianity, especially as they settled and integrated into local communities. Churches were built in the Danelaw, and Norse leaders were baptized, sometimes taking English names and marrying into noble families. The 10th century saw the gradual unification of England under a single king. Edward the Elder, Ethelflaed, and their successors pushed the boundaries of Wessex northward, capturing Viking towns and fortresses. In 927, Athelstan, grandson of Alfred the Great, became the first king to rule over all of England. He defeated a coalition of Scots, Vikings, and Welsh at the Battle of Brunanburh, securing his place as the founder of the English nation. But the Viking threat did not disappear. New waves of Norse invaders, known as the Danes, continued to attack England. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the most famous of these was Sweyn Forkbeard, who became King of England in 1013, and his son Canute the Great, who ruled a North Sea empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. Canute's reign brought a period of peace and prosperity, as he balanced the interests of his English and Danish subjects. He supported the church, maintained law and order, and promoted trade and culture. But after his death, the kingdom was plunged into chaos once more, as rival claimants fought for the throne. In 1066, the death of the English King Edward the Confessor set off a chain of events that would change the history of Britain forever. Three powerful men claimed the crown: Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king; Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway; and William, Duke of Normandy. The result was a year of invasion, battle, and transformation. The Viking Age in Britain was a time of violence, upheaval, and change, but also of creativity, adaptation, and cultural exchange. The Norsemen left a deep mark on the language, law, and landscape of the islands. Their legacy can be seen in the place names, the stories, and the spirit of the people. The age of the Vikings came to an end, but their influence would live on, shaping the destiny of Britain for centuries to come. In the year 1066, the destiny of England changed forever. The death of King Edward the Confessor left a throne without a clear heir, and three powerful men claimed the right to rule. Harold Godwinson, the last great Anglo-Saxon king, was chosen by the English nobles. Harald Hardrada, the fierce king of Norway, believed he had a claim through ancient agreements. And across the channel in Normandy, William, the ambitious duke, prepared his own bid for the crown, claiming a promise from Edward and an oath from Harold himself. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic years in British history. Harold Godwinson's reign began with crisis. In September, Harald Hardrada invaded from the north, joined by Harold's own brother Tostig. The English king marched his army north in a desperate race, meeting the Norwegians at Stamford Bridge. In a fierce and bloody battle, Harold's forces won a stunning victory. Harold Hardrada was killed, and the Viking threat was ended. But even as the English celebrated, news arrived that William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. Harold's exhausted army turned south, marching day and night to meet the new invader. On October 14, 1066, the two armies met at Hastings. The battle raged for hours, with Norman cavalry charging and English shield walls holding firm. The fate of England hung in the balance. Late in the day, Harold was killed, legend says, by an arrow to the eye, and the English line broke. William was victorious. He marched to London, and on Christmas Day, he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The Norman Conquest had begun. William the Conqueror brought with him a new ruling class, a new language, and a new way of life. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was replaced by Norman lords, who built mighty stone castles across the land, symbols of their power and centers of control. The Normans introduced the feudal system, dividing the land among their followers in exchange for loyalty and military service. The peasants, or serfs, worked the land, owing labor and produce to their lords. The king stood at the top, the ultimate owner of all the land, and his word was law. The Normans transformed England's government and society. They conducted a great survey of the land, known as the Domesday Book, recording every village, field, and animal for taxation and control. They built cathedrals and monasteries in the Romanesque style, filling the land with stone towers and arches. The English language was forever changed, as Norman French mixed with Old English to create the beginnings of Middle English. Words for law, government, art, and food entered the language, and the culture of the court became a blend of Saxon and Norman traditions. Medieval England was a land of contrasts. The countryside was dotted with villages, each with its church, manor house, and fields. The towns grew, bustling with merchants, craftsmen, and markets. Fairs and festivals brought people together, while the church marked the rhythm of life, with its bells, prayers, and holy days. The great cathedrals, Canterbury, York, Durham, rose above the landscape, testaments to faith and ambition. Monasteries became centers of learning, charity, and power, owning vast estates and influencing kings and popes alike. The feudal system shaped every aspect of life. Lords and knights owed service to the king, while peasants worked the land in exchange for protection. Justice was local, often harsh, and based on custom and tradition. The Magna Carta settled disputes, punished crimes, and enforced the rules of the community. Life was hard for most people. Famine, disease, and war were constant threats. The Black Death, which struck in the mid-14th century, killed nearly half the population, leaving villages empty and fields untended. Yet, the people endured, rebuilding their lives and communities in the face of disaster. The medieval period was also a time of chivalry, romance, and legend. The stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, though rooted in earlier times, were celebrated in song and story. Troubadours sang of love and adventure, and tournaments tested the skills of knights. The code of chivalry demanded courage, honor, and loyalty, but also mercy and courtesy. The reality was often more brutal, but the ideals inspired generations. The church was the heart of medieval life. From the smallest village chapel to the grandest cathedral, the church shaped beliefs, morals, and daily routines. Monks and nuns devoted their lives to prayer, study, and service. Pilgrims traveled to holy sites, seeking healing, forgiveness, or adventure. The church was also a source of conflict, as kings and popes struggled for power and influence. The murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in his own cathedral, shocked the nation and made him a martyr and a saint. The Normans and their descendants ruled England for centuries, but the land was never at peace for long. Rival claims to the throne, disputes over land and power, and the ambitions of kings and nobles led to constant conflict. The Plantagenet dynasty, which followed the Normans, would see England embroiled in wars at home and abroad, from the struggles with Wales and Scotland to the long and bloody 100 Years' War with France. Yet, the legacy of the Norman Conquest was profound. It created a new aristocracy, a new language, and a new sense of nationhood. The castles, cathedrals, and laws of medieval England laid the foundations for the country that would emerge in the centuries to come. The story of the United Kingdom is a story of invasion and adaptation, of conflict and creativity, of people who shaped and were shaped by the land they called home. The Norman Conquest had forever changed the face of England, but the centuries that followed would see the land shaped and reshaped by new dynasties, new ideas, and new struggles for power. The Plantagenet dynasty, which began with Henry II in 1154, would rule England for more than 300 years, leaving a legacy of castles, cathedrals, law, and legend. The Plantagenets were a family of ambition, energy, and conflict. Their story is one of glory and disaster, of kings and queens, knights and rebels, and the slow, painful birth of the rights and freedoms that would define the United Kingdom. Henry, too, was a king of vision and determination. He inherited not only England but vast lands in France, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, making him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Henry was a reformer, determined to bring order to his kingdom. He reorganized the courts, established royal justice, and sent judges on circuit to enforce the king's law. The common law, based on custom and precedent, began to take shape, creating a system that would influence the world. But Henry's reign was also marked by conflict. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine brought him wealth and power, but also trouble. Eleanor was a formidable woman, and their sons Richard, Geoffrey, and John were ambitious and rebellious. The most famous conflict of Henry's reign was with Thomas Becket, his friend and Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry wanted to control the church, but Becket defended its independence. Their quarrel ended in tragedy when Becket was murdered in his own cathedral by knights who believed they were acting on the king's wishes. Becket became a martyr and a saint, and Henry was forced to do public penance. After Henry's death, his son Richard the Lionheart became king. Richard was a warrior, famous for his courage and skill in battle. He spent most of his reign on crusade in the Holy Land, fighting Saladin and seeking glory for Christendom. Richard's absence left England in the hands of his brother John, whose rule would become one of the most infamous in English history. King John was a man of talent, but also of weakness and cruelty. He lost most of the French lands to the king of France, angered the church, and imposed heavy taxes on his people. His disputes with the barons led to rebellion, and in 1215, at Runnymede beside the River Thames, John was forced to seal the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, or Great Charter, was a document unlike any seen before. It set out the rights of the barons, limited the power of the king, and established the principle that the monarch was subject to the law. No free man could be imprisoned or punished without judgment by his peers. Justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. Though intended to resolve a crisis, Magna Carta became a symbol of liberty and the rule of law, inspiring generations to come. John's reign ended in chaos, but the Plantagenet line continued. His son Henry III faced rebellion and civil war, as powerful barons demanded a greater say in government. Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, led a revolt and summoned a parliament that included not only nobles, but also knights and burgesses from the towns. Though de Montfort was defeated and killed, the idea of parliament and assembly, representing the people, had taken root. The 13th and 14th centuries were a time of both achievement and turmoil. Edward I, known as Longshanks, was a formidable king. He conquered Wales, building mighty castles at Carnarvon, Conwy, and Harlech, and brought the Welsh princes under English rule. He sought to subdue Scotland, but met fierce resistance from leaders like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. The wars with Scotland would continue for generations, shaping the identity of both nations. Edward I also summoned the Model Parliament in 1295, bringing together nobles, clergy, knights, and townsmen. The principle that the king should govern with the advice and consent of his subjects was becoming established, though real power remained with the monarch and the great lords. Edward II, his son, was a weak and troubled king. His reign was marked by defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce won a famous victory for Scotland. Edward's favoritism, mismanagement, and inability to control his barons led to his deposition and murder. His son, Edward III, restored royal authority and led England into the 100 Years' War with France, a conflict that would dominate the 14th and 15th centuries. The 100 Years' War was a struggle for the French crown, but it was also a contest of national identity, chivalry, and ambition. English armies, led by Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, won famous victories at Crécy and Poitiers, using the longbow to devastating effect. The war brought glory and riches, but also ruin and suffering. Towns were sacked, fields burned, and thousands died in battle or from disease. The war also brought heroes and legends. The Black Prince became a symbol of chivalry and courage. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who led the French to victory, became a saint and a martyr. The war ended in defeat for England, but it left a legacy of pride and memory that would shape the nation's story. The 14th century was also a time of disaster. In 1348, the Black Death swept across England, killing nearly half the population. Villages were abandoned, fields went untended, and the old order was shaken to its core. The shortage of labor gave peasants new power, and revolts broke out as they demanded better conditions and freedom from serfdom. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, led by Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical priest John Ball, shook the foundations of society. The rebels marched on London, demanding justice and an end to oppression. Though the revolt was crushed, the world had changed. Serfdom declined, wages rose, and the seeds of a new society were sown. The Plantagenet kings faced constant challenges: rebellion, war, and the ambitions of their own family. Richard II, a boy king, was deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. The Lancastrian and Yorkist branches of the family would fight for the throne in the Wars of the Roses, a bloody struggle that would end the Plantagenet dynasty and bring the Tudors to power. Yet, the legacy of the Plantagenets was profound. They built the great cathedrals and castles, established the common law, and laid the foundations of Parliament and the rights of the people. The Magna Carta, the Model Parliament, and the struggles for justice and liberty became part of the English identity. The story of the United Kingdom is a story of kings and rebels, of law and liberty, of triumph and tragedy. The Plantagenet Age was a time of glory and disaster, of knights and peasants, of faith and doubt. It was a time when the seeds of modern Britain were planted, and the long journey toward freedom and democracy began in the 14th century. England stood at a crossroads. The Plantagenet kings had built a powerful realm, but the land was about to be tested by disaster, war, and social upheaval on a scale never seen before. The Black Death and the 100 Years' War would leave scars that shaped the destiny of the kingdom and its people for generations. The story of the Black Death begins far from England, in the steppes of Central Asia, where a deadly new disease began to spread along the trade routes that connected East and West. By the late 1340s, the plague had reached the ports of Italy and France, carried by ships and merchants, rats and fleas. In 1348, the Black Death arrived in England, landing first at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there, it spread with terrifying speed, moving along the roads and rivers, reaching every corner of the land. The symptoms were sudden and horrifying: fever, chills, swelling of the lymph nodes, and dark blotches on the skin. People died within days, and there was no cure, no protection, and no escape. The impact of the Black Death was catastrophic. In less than 2 years, nearly half the population of England, perhaps 2 million people, died. Villages were abandoned. Fields went untended, and the old rhythms of life were shattered. The dead were buried in mass graves, and the living struggled to make sense of the disaster. Some believed it was a punishment from God. Others blamed outsiders or the corruption of society. The church, which had been the center of comfort and hope, was shaken to its core. Priests and monks died in great numbers, and faith was tested as never before. Yet out of the horror of the plague came profound change. With so many people gone, labor became scarce, and those who survived found new opportunities. Wages rose, serfdom declined, and peasants gained more freedom to move and bargain for better conditions. The old order was challenged, and the seeds of a new society were sown. The Black Death also changed the culture of England. Art and literature became obsessed with death, fate, and the fragility of life. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, appeared in paintings and poems, reminding everyone that death came for rich and poor alike. The great cathedrals and churches were filled with images of skeletons, hourglasses, and the Last Judgment. The trauma of the plague lingered for generations, shaping the imagination and the soul of the nation. Even as England struggled to recover from the Black Death, it was drawn into a conflict that would last for more than a century: the 100 Years' War with France. The roots of the war lay in the tangled claims of the English and French royal families. Edward III of England believed he had a right to the French crown through his mother Isabella, the daughter of the French king. The French rejected his claim, and in 1337, war broke out. The 100 Years' War was not a single conflict, but a series of campaigns, battles, and truces that stretched across the 14th and 15th centuries. It was fought on the fields of France, in the towns and castles of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Gascony, and in the hearts and minds of the people. The war brought both glory and suffering. English armies, led by Edward III and his son, the Black Prince, won famous victories at Crécy and Poitiers. The longbow, a weapon of the English yeoman, proved devastating against the armored knights of France. At Crécy in 1346, a small English force defeated a much larger French army, changing the nature of warfare forever. At Poitiers in 1356, the Black Prince captured the French king, John II, and brought him to England as a prisoner. The victories brought wealth and prestige, but they did not end the war. The French fought back, and the conflict dragged on, draining resources and lives. The war also brought suffering to the people of both countries. Towns were sacked, fields burned, and civilians killed or driven from their homes. The cost of war was paid in taxes, labor, and blood. The English kings raised money by taxing wool, the country's most valuable export, and by borrowing from merchants and bankers. The burden fell hardest on the poor, who saw their rents rise and their wages fall. The war also brought heroes and legends. The Black Prince became a symbol of chivalry and courage, his black armor and white plume inspiring fear and admiration. The French found their own hero in Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who claimed to be guided by visions from God. Joan led the French to victory at Orleans and helped to turn the tide of the war. She was captured by the English, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. But her spirit lived on, and she became a saint and a symbol of French resistance. The 100 Years' War was not just a struggle for the French crown. It was a contest of national identity, pride, and ambition. The English kings claimed the title King of France for generations, and the fleur-de-lis was added to the royal arms. The war also changed the nature of kingship and government. The need to raise money and armies led to the growth of Parliament, as the king had to seek approval for new taxes. The Commons, representing the towns and shires, gained more power and influence, and the idea of government by consent began to take root. The war also brought changes to the military. The old fuel levies were replaced by professional soldiers, mercenaries, and longbowmen. Castles and walled towns became less important as gunpowder and cannons changed the art of siege and defense. The chivalric ideals of the knight gave way to the realities of modern warfare. The end of the war was as complex as its beginning. In the early 15th century, Henry V of England won a stunning victory at Agincourt, where a small English army defeated a much larger French force. Henry married the French Princess Catherine, and for a time, it seemed that England would rule both kingdoms. But Henry died young, and his infant son, Henry VI, inherited a divided and troubled realm. The French, inspired by Joan of Arc and led by Charles VII, gradually drove the English out of France. By 1453, only the port of Calais remained in English hands. The dream of an English empire in France was over, and the country turned inward, facing new challenges and conflicts at home. The Black Death and the 100 Years' War left England changed forever. The population was smaller, the economy was different, and the old order had been shaken. The power of the nobility was weakened, and the rise of Parliament and the Commons set the stage for new struggles over the rights of the people and the authority of the king. The culture of England was also transformed. The trauma of plague and war inspired new forms of art, literature, and religion. The works of Geoffrey Chaucer, especially the Canterbury Tales, captured the voices and stories of a changing society. The church faced criticism and calls for reform as people questioned its wealth, power, and corruption. The seeds of the Reformation were sown, and the stage was set for the great conflicts of the late Middle Ages. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time of suffering and survival, of loss and renewal. The people of England endured famine, plague, and war, but they also built new communities, created new forms of government, and laid the foundations for the modern world. The story of the United Kingdom is a story of resilience, adaptation, and hope, a story that continues to unfold with each new generation. The 15th century in England was a time of turmoil, ambition, and bloodshed, a period when the fate of the crown was decided not by law or peaceful succession, but by the sword. The Wars of the Roses, A series of dynastic conflicts between the rival houses of Lancaster and York would plunge the kingdom into decades of civil war, betrayal, and shifting alliances. The struggle for the throne would see kings deposed and murdered, families torn apart, and the very fabric of English society tested to its limits. Yet, out of this chaos would emerge a new dynasty, the Tudors, and the foundations of the modern British state. The roots of the Wars of the Roses lay in the aftermath of the 100 Years' War and the weakness of the Lancastrian kings. Henry V, who became king as an infant, was a gentle and pious man, more suited to prayer and contemplation than to the harsh realities of rule. His reign was marked by loss and failure. The English were driven from almost all their lands in France, and the glory of Agincourt faded into memory. At home, the king's inability to control his nobles, his bouts of mental illness, and the influence of his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, created a vacuum of power. The great lords of England, many of them descended from royal blood, began to plot and maneuver for influence. Chief among them was Richard, Duke of York, a man with a strong claim to the throne and a determination to assert his rights. The rivalry between York and Lancaster, symbolized by the white rose and the red rose, would soon erupt into open conflict. The first battles of the wars were fought in the 1450s. The king's supporters, known as Lancastrians, and the followers of the Duke of York, the Yorkists, clashed at St. Albans, Blura Heath, and Ludford Bridge. The fighting was brutal and personal, with old friendships shattered and families divided. The Duke of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, but his son Edward took up the cause. In 1461, Edward defeated the Lancastrians at Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, and was crowned King Edward IV. For a time, it seemed that the Yorkists had triumphed. Edward IV was a strong and charismatic ruler, but his reign was not secure. The Lancastrians, led by Queen Margaret and the exiled Henry VI, continued to plot and fight. The great noble families, Neville, Percy, Stafford, shifted their loyalties as fortunes changed. The most powerful of all was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Warwick had helped Edward to the throne, but when the king asserted his independence, Warwick turned against him, restoring Henry VI to the throne for a brief period known as the Readeption. The wars were not just battles between armies. They were struggles for power, land, and survival. Castles were besieged, towns sacked, and the countryside ravaged. The common people suffered as armies marched back and forth, demanding supplies and punishing those who resisted. Law and order broke down, and the authority of the crown was challenged at every turn. In 1471, Edward IV returned from exile and won a series of decisive victories at Barnet and Tewkesbury. Warwick the Kingmaker was killed, and Henry VI was captured and murdered in the Tower of London. The Yorkist cause seemed secure, and Edward ruled in relative peace until his death in 1483. But the wars were not over. Edward's young son, Edward V, was declared king, but his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized the throne, becoming Richard III. The fate of the young princes, known as the Princes in the Tower, remains one of history's great mysteries. Many believe they were murdered on Richard's orders, though the truth may never be known. Richard III was a capable ruler, but his claim to the throne was weak, and he faced opposition from both Yorkists and Lancastrians. In 1485, a new challenger appeared, Henry Tudor, a distant relative of the Lancastrian line, who had spent years in exile in France. Henry landed in Wales, gathered supporters, and marched to meet Richard at Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth was the last great battle of the Wars of the Roses. Richard fought bravely, but was betrayed by some of his allies. He was killed in the fighting, the last English king to die in battle. Henry Tudor was crowned King Henry VII on the battlefield, and a Tudor dynasty was born. Henry married Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses and symbolically ending the conflict. The Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York were combined to create the Tudor Rose, a symbol of unity and peace. The Wars of the Roses left deep scars on England. The nobility was decimated, many great families destroyed or impoverished. The power of the crown was strengthened as the new Tudor kings sought to prevent the rise of overmighty subjects. The experience of civil war made the English wary of disorder and eager for strong, stable government. The wars also changed the culture of England. The chivalric ideals of the knight gave way to the realities of power politics. The literature of the time, from the chronicles of the wars to the poetry of the court, reflected the uncertainty and violence of the age. The stories of Richard III, the Princes in the Tower, and the rise of the Tudors would inspire writers for centuries, from Shakespeare to the present day. Yet, the end of the Wars of the Roses was not just the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of a new era. The Tudors would bring peace, prosperity, and the Renaissance to England. They would build a strong, centralized state, reform the church, and lay the foundations for the modern United Kingdom. The legacy of the Wars of the Roses is a reminder of the dangers of division and the power of unity. The story of England is a story of struggle and survival, of loss and renewal, of a people who endured the storms of history and emerged stronger. For at the end of the Wars of the Roses brought a new dawn to England, a time of hope, ambition, and transformation. The Tudor dynasty, founded by Henry VII, would rule for more than a century, guiding the kingdom through some of its most dramatic and defining moments. The Tudors would bring peace to a land torn by civil war, but they would also unleash forces that would change the nation forever: religious revolution, exploration, and the birth of the modern state. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, was a cautious and shrewd ruler. He knew the dangers of division and worked tirelessly to secure his throne. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, and symbolically ending the dynastic conflict. Henry restored order, rebuilt the royal finances, and kept a close watch on the nobility, using bonds, fines, and the Court of Star Chamber to control potential rivals. He encouraged trade, supported the growth of towns, and laid the foundations for a strong, centralized monarchy. His reign was not without challenges, rebellions, pretenders, and plots, but he died in 1509, leaving a secure throne to his son, Henry VIII. Henry VIII is one of the most famous and controversial kings in English history. Tall, athletic, and charismatic in his youth, Henry was a Renaissance prince skilled in music, sport, and learning. He dreamed of glory in war and splendor at court. But Henry's reign would be defined not by his early promise, but by his relentless pursuit of a male heir and his break with the Catholic Church. Henry married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Spanish king and queen, but their marriage produced only one surviving child, Mary. Desperate for a son, Henry sought an annulment from the Pope, but when the Church refused, he took matters into his own hands, in a series of bold and unprecedented moves. Henry broke with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and dissolved the monasteries. The English Reformation had begun. The monasteries, which had been centers of learning, charity, and power, were closed, their lands and treasures seized by the crown. The wealth of the church flowed into the royal coffers, and the landscape of England was forever changed. Ancient abbeys and priories fell into ruin, and the old ways of faith and community were swept away. Henry's break with Rome was not just a religious revolution. It was a political and social earthquake. The king's authority was now absolute, and loyalty to the crown was demanded above all else. Those who resisted, such as Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, were executed. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a great northern rebellion against the changes, was crushed with brutal force. Yet, the Reformation also brought new freedoms and opportunities. The Bible was translated into English, and people could read the scriptures for themselves. New ideas about faith, conscience, and the rights of the individual began to take root. Henry's personal life was as tumultuous as his reign. He married 6 times, seeking love, alliance, and above all, a son. His wives, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr, each played a role in the drama of the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn, the mother of Elizabeth, was executed on charges of adultery and treason. Jane Seymour gave Henry his longed-for son, Edward, but died soon after childbirth. The fates of the queens became the stuff of legend. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry's later years were marked by tyranny, suspicion, and ill health. He grew obese and paranoid, executing friends and enemies alike. Yet, he left a legacy that would shape England for centuries. When he died in 1547, his 9-year-old son, Edward VI, became king. Edward's reign was short and troubled. Guided by Protestant advisors, the young king pushed the Reformation further, introducing a new prayer book and abolishing many Catholic practices. But Edward was sickly, and he died in 1553, plunging the kingdom into crisis. Mary I, Henry's eldest daughter, became queen. A devout Catholic, Mary sought to restore the old faith and reunite England with Rome. Her reign was marked by religious persecution, as hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake. The violence earned her the name Bloody Mary, and her marriage to Philip II of Spain was deeply unpopular. Mary's efforts to reverse the Reformation failed, and when she died in 1558, the crown passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I is one of the most celebrated monarchs in British history. Her reign, known as the Elizabethan Age, was a time of exploration, creativity, and national pride. Elizabeth was a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, balancing the demands of religion, politics, and foreign threats. She refused to marry, declaring herself married to her people, and used her single status as a tool of diplomacy. Under Elizabeth, the Church of England was firmly established as a Protestant church, but with rituals and traditions that appealed to both reformers and conservatives. The Elizabethan settlement brought a measure of religious peace, though Catholics and radical Protestants still faced persecution. Elizabeth's court was a center of culture and learning. Writers such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser created works of enduring genius. The arts flourished, with music, poetry, and theater reaching new heights. The Queen herself was a patron of the arts, and her image, glorified in portraits, pageants, and poetry, became a symbol of the nation. The Elizabethan Age was also a time of exploration and adventure. English sailors and privateers, such as Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and John Hawkins, sailed the seas in search of new lands, wealth, and glory. They challenged the power of Spain, raided its treasure ships, and claimed distant territories for the crown. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a defining moment, celebrated as a triumph of English courage and ingenuity. Yet, Elizabeth's reign was not without challenges. Plots and conspiracies threatened her life, and the question of succession haunted her court. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic rival, was a moment of high drama and danger. The Queen's refusal to marry or name an heir created uncertainty, and as she grew older, the nation wondered what would come next. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty came to an end. She was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. The legacy of the Tudors was profound. They had transformed England from a feudal kingdom into a centralized state, reformed the church, and laid the foundations for the British Empire. The English language, literature, and culture flourished, and the seeds of modern democracy were sown. The story of the Tudors is a story of ambition, passion, and change. It is a story of kings and queens, of faith and power, of triumph and tragedy. The England they left behind was a land forever changed, ready to face the challenges and opportunities of a new age, the death of Mary I and the accession of Elizabeth. In 1558 marked the beginning of one of the most celebrated and transformative eras in English history. Elizabeth's reign, which would last for 45 years, became known as the Elizabethan Age, a time of cultural flowering, religious settlement, political intrigue, and the first steps toward global exploration and empire. The young queen inherited a kingdom divided by religion, threatened by foreign powers, and uncertain about its future. Yet, through intelligence, caution, and charisma, Elizabeth would guide England through crisis after crisis, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and her very existence was a symbol of the tumultuous changes of the Tudor era. Her mother had been executed, her legitimacy questioned, and her childhood marked by danger and uncertainty. Yet, Elizabeth emerged as a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, skilled in languages, diplomacy, and the art of survival. She understood the power of image and used her status as the Virgin Queen to her advantage, refusing to marry and declaring herself wedded to her people. Her court became a place of spectacle and ceremony, where pageants, tournaments, and masks celebrated the glory of the Queen and the nation. One of Elizabeth's first and greatest challenges was religion. England had swung between Catholicism and Protestantism under her father and siblings, and the country was deeply divided. Elizabeth sought a middle way, establishing the Church of England as a Protestant church with rituals and traditions that retained some Catholic elements. The Elizabethan religious settlement, embodied in the Act of Uniformity and the 39 Articles, brought a measure of peace, though Catholics and radical Puritans still faced persecution. The Queen's policy was one of moderation and compromise, but she was ruthless when her authority was threatened. Plots and conspiracies were a constant danger. Catholic powers in Europe, especially Spain and the papacy, saw Elizabeth as a heretic and sought to replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic cousin with a strong claim to the English throne. Mary's presence in England, after being forced to flee Scotland, became a focus for rebellion and intrigue. The Northern Rebellion of 1569, the Ridolfi Plot, the Throckmorton Plot, and the Babington Plot all aimed to depose Elizabeth and restore Catholicism. The Queen's spymaster, Sir Francis Walsingham, built a network of informers and code-breakers to uncover and thwart these threats. In 1586, after the discovery of the Babington Plot, Mary, Queen of Scots, was tried and executed, a decision that shocked Europe and made Elizabeth a target for Catholic vengeance. The greatest threat came from Spain, the most powerful nation in Europe. King Philip II, angered by English support for Dutch rebels and attacks on Spanish treasure ships, prepared a massive invasion. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail for England, a fleet of more than 100 ships carrying soldiers, cannons, and the hopes of Catholic Europe. The English Navy, led by Sir Francis Drake, Lord Howard of Effingham, and others, met the Armada in the Channel. Using smaller, faster ships and innovative tactics, the English harassed the Spanish fleet, setting fire to their ships and forcing them into the North Sea. Storms and bad luck finished the job, and the shattered Armada limped home. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a turning point, celebrated as a triumph of English courage, seamanship, and divine favor. Elizabeth's speech to her troops at Tilbury, declaring that she had the heart and stomach of a king, became legendary. The Elizabethan Age was not just a time of war and intrigue. It was a golden age of culture and creativity. The Queen's court attracted poets, musicians, artists, and scholars. William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Edmund Spenser, and many others created works of enduring genius. The theaters of London, the Globe, the Rose, the Swan were filled with audiences eager for drama, comedy, and spectacle. Shakespeare's plays from Hamlet to Macbeth to A Midsummer Night's Dream explored the depths of human nature, the complexities of power, and the beauty of language. The sonnet, the madrigal, and the masque flourished, and the English language itself was enriched and transformed. Elizabethan society was vibrant and diverse. The population of England grew rapidly, and London became one of the largest cities in Europe. The city was a place of opportunity and danger, with merchants, craftsmen, apprentices, beggars, and thieves crowding its streets. The River Thames was alive with boats and barges, carrying goods and people from all over the world. The countryside was changing too, as the enclosure of common lands and the growth of sheep farming transformed rural life. The gentry and merchant classes rose in wealth and influence, while the old feudal order faded. Education and learning were valued. Grammar schools and universities flourished, and literacy spread among the middle classes. The printing press made books and pamphlets more widely available, fueling debate and the spread of new ideas. Science and exploration advanced, with figures like John Dee, the Queen's astrologer and mathematician, pushing the boundaries of knowledge. Medicine, astronomy, and navigation all made progress, though much remained mysterious and dangerous. The Elizabethan Age was also a time of exploration and expansion. English sailors and adventurers set out to discover new lands, trade routes, and fortunes. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, raiding Spanish settlements and returning with treasure. Sir Walter Raleigh attempted to establish colonies in the New World, founding the ill-fated Roanoke colony. The Muscovy Company, the East India Company, and other trading ventures opened new markets in Russia, Asia, and the Americas. The dream of empire was born, though it would be centuries before it was fully realized. Life in Elizabethan England was not easy for everyone. Poverty, disease, and crime were common, and the gap between rich and poor was wide. The poor law sought to provide relief for the destitute, but many struggled to survive. Women's roles were limited, though some, like Elizabeth herself, defied expectations. The law was harsh, with public executions, whippings, and the stocks as common punishments. Yet, the people found joy in festivals, fairs, and the rhythms of the seasons. May Day, Christmas, and harvest celebrations brought communities together, and music, dance, and storytelling were part of everyday life. The end of Elizabeth's reign brought uncertainty. The Queen had no children, and the question of succession loomed large. As she grew older, courtiers and foreign powers speculated about who would inherit the throne. In 1603, Elizabeth died peacefully at Richmond Palace, ending the Tudor dynasty. She was succeeded by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland and beginning the Stuart era. The legacy of the Elizabethan Age is profound. It was a time of national pride, cultural achievement, and the first steps toward global power. The English language, literature, and identity were forever changed. The seeds of empire, religious tolerance, and constitutional government were sown. The story of Elizabethan England is a story of ambition and adventure, of faith and doubt, of a people who dared to dream and to create. The world they left behind was richer, more complex, and more connected than ever before. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended, and the crown passed to her distant cousin, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. This union of the crowns brought together two ancient kingdoms under one monarch, but it did not create a single nation. England and Scotland remained separate countries, each with its own parliament, laws, and church. Yet, the Stuart era would be a time of great change, conflict, and transformation, a period that would see the rise of new ideas, the clash of king and parliament, and the birth of modern Britain. James I was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and had spent his childhood in the turbulent courts of Scotland. He was a learned man, a patron of the arts, and a believer in the divine right of kings. The idea that monarchs ruled by God's will and were answerable only to him. James dreamed of uniting his kingdoms, bringing peace to Europe, and ruling as a wise and benevolent king. But he soon discovered that the English Parliament and people had their own ideas about power and liberty. The early years of James's reign were marked by hope and optimism. The long wars with Spain ended, and a new translation of the Bible, the King James Version, was published, becoming one of the most influential books in the English language. The court was a center of culture, with writers like William Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, and John Donne creating works of enduring genius. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. James's belief in absolute monarchy clashed with the growing power of Parliament. His efforts to raise money without parliamentary consent, his favoritism towards Scottish courtiers, and his attempts to make peace with Catholic powers angered many. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which a group of Catholic conspirators, led by Guy Fawkes, tried to blow up the king and Parliament, shocked the nation and deepened suspicion of Catholics. James's son, Charles I, inherited the throne in 1625. Charles was a man of principle and dignity, but also of stubbornness and pride. He believed passionately in the divine right of kings and was determined to rule without interference. Charles's reign was marked by conflict from the start. He married a French Catholic princess, Henrietta Maria, raising fears of a return to Catholicism. He levied taxes without parliamentary approval, imposed unpopular religious reforms, and dissolved Parliament when it opposed him. The king's attempts to rule without Parliament, known as the personal rule or the 11 years' tyranny, created deep resentment. Charles's advisors, especially the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud, and the Earl of Strafford, were seen as symbols of royal tyranny and Catholic influence. The king's efforts to impose a new prayer book on Scotland sparked rebellion, and soon England itself was on the brink of crisis. In 1640, faced with war in Scotland and desperate for money, Charles was forced to recall Parliament. The long Parliament, as it became known, was determined to limit the king's power. It passed laws to prevent the king from dissolving Parliament, abolished unpopular courts, and executed Strafford and Laud. The struggle between king and Parliament became a struggle for the soul of the nation. In 1642, civil war broke out. The Davesin country was divided between royalists or cavaliers, who supported the king, and parliamentarians or roundheads, who demanded reform. Families, towns, and even churches were split by loyalty and belief. The war was fought in fields and towns, on moors and in cities, with battles at Edgehill, Marston Moor, and Naseby. The armies were made up of local militias, professional soldiers, and volunteers. The parliamentarians, led by men like Oliver Cromwell, created the new model army, a disciplined, well-trained force that would prove decisive. The war was brutal and destructive. Towns were besieged, fields burned, and thousands died in battle, or from disease and famine. The king's forces were gradually pushed back, and in 1646, Charles surrendered to the Scots. But the conflict was not over. Disputes between Parliament, the army, and the king led to a second civil war. Charles was tried for treason, found guilty, and executed in 1649, the first time in English history that a king was put on trial and killed by his own people. The execution of Charles I sent shockwaves across Europe. Monarchs and princes were horrified, and many in England were filled with fear and uncertainty. The monarchy was abolished, and England was declared a republic, the Commonwealth ruled by Parliament and, increasingly, by the army. Oliver Cromwell emerged as the dominant figure, a skilled general and a man of deep religious conviction. Cromwell sought to create a godly society, free from tyranny and corruption. He led campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, crushing resistance with ruthless efficiency. Cromwell's rule was marked by both reform and repression. He promoted religious tolerance for Protestants, supported education and trade, and tried to create a more just and moral society. But his government was also authoritarian, with censorship, military rule, and the suppression of dissent. The experiment in Republican government was short-lived. After Cromwell's death in 1658, his son Richard proved unable to hold power. The army and Parliament fell into conflict, and the country slid toward chaos. In 1660, the monarchy was restored, and Charles II, the son of the executed king, returned to England in triumph. The Stuart Restoration brought a return to monarchy, but the world had changed. The king's power was now limited by law and by the memory of civil war. Parliament had established its right to meet, to control taxation, and to hold the government to account. The seeds of constitutional monarchy had been sown. The Stuart era was a time of great change and challenge. The Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666 tested the resilience of the people. The city was rebuilt, with Christopher Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral rising above the skyline. Science and learning flourished, with figures like Isaac Newton, Robert Hooke, and Samuel Pepys making discoveries and recording the life of the age. Religion remained a source of conflict. The struggle between Catholics and Protestants, Anglicans, and dissenters shaped politics and society. The reign of James II, a Catholic king, brought the crisis to a head. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution saw James deposed and replaced by his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange. The Bill of Rights, passed in 1689, established the supremacy of Parliament, the rights of the people, and the limits of royal power. The English Civil War and the Stuart era were times of conflict, creativity, and transformation. The struggle between king and Parliament, between liberty and authority would shape the future of the United Kingdom. The legacy of this period is found in the rights and freedoms enjoyed today, in the balance of power between government and people, and in the enduring spirit of resilience and hope. The end of the Stuart era and the events of the late 17th century marked a turning point in the history of the United Kingdom. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the birth of constitutional monarchy would forever change the relationship between the crown and the people, between government and governed. It was a time of revolution without bloodshed, of new ideas and old fears, of hope and uncertainty. The legacy of this period would shape the future of Britain and the world. The seeds of the Glorious Revolution were sown in the conflicts and crises of the Stuart Age. The execution of Charles I, the rule of Oliver Cromwell, the restoration of Charles II, and the religious and political struggles that followed had left the kingdom wary of tyranny and chaos. The memory of civil war was fresh, and the people valued stability, order, and the rule of law. Yet, the question of religion and the limits of royal power remained unresolved. Charles II, known as the Merry Monarch, brought a sense of relief and celebration to England after the years of Puritan rule. His court was lively, filled with music, theater, and wit. Science and learning flourished with the founding of the Royal Society and the discoveries of Isaac Newton and others. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Charles had no legitimate children, and his brother James, Duke of York, was a Catholic. The fear of a Catholic monarch haunted the nation, and Parliament passed laws to exclude Catholics from the throne. The Popish plot, a fabricated conspiracy, fueled anti-Catholic hysteria, and the exclusion crisis divided the country. When Charles II died in 1685, James II became king. James was open about his Catholic faith and determined to promote religious tolerance for Catholics and dissenters. He appointed Catholics to high office, suspended laws against them, and tried to rule without Parliament. Many saw his actions as a threat to the Protestant religion and the liberties of the people. The birth of a son to James and his Catholic Queen in 1688 raised the prospect of a Catholic dynasty, and opposition grew. A group of Protestant nobles and politicians invited William of Orange, the Dutch husband of James's Protestant daughter Mary, to intervene. William landed in England with an army, and James, finding little support, fled to France. The Glorious Revolution was accomplished with minimal violence, but its consequences were profound. William and Mary were offered the crown by Parliament, but only on condition that they accept the Bill of Rights. This document set out the rights of Parliament and the people, limited the powers of the monarch, and established the principle that the king or queen ruled with the consent of the governed. No monarch could suspend laws, levy taxes, or maintain a standing army without parliamentary approval. The right to free speech in Parliament, regular elections, and the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment were enshrined in law. The Glorious Revolution was not just a change of rulers. It was a revolution in the very nature of government. The idea of the divine right of kings was replaced by the principle of constitutional monarchy. The monarch was now subject to the law, and the rights of the people were protected by Parliament and the courts. The Act of Settlement of 1701 ensured that only Protestants could inherit the throne, and the independence of the judiciary was strengthened. The Revolution also had profound effects on religion. The Toleration Act of 1689 granted freedom of worship to Protestant dissenters, though Catholics and non-Christians remained excluded from many rites. The Church of England remained the established church, but the seeds of religious pluralism were sown. The new order was not without challenges. Jacobite supporters of James II and his descendants launched a series of uprisings in Scotland and Ireland, seeking to restore the Stuart line. The most famous of these was the 1745 rebellion led by Bonnie, Prince Charlie, which ended in defeat at the Battle of Culloden. The Jacobite cause faded, but the memory of the lost Stuart kings lingered in song and legend. The 18th century was a time of political, economic, and social transformation. The Union of England and Scotland in 1707 created the Kingdom of Great Britain, with a single parliament at Westminster. The Act of Union was driven by politics, economics, and the desire for stability. Scotland retained its own legal and educational systems, but the two nations were now united under one crown and one government. The new kingdom faced challenges at home and abroad. The Hanoverian dynasty, beginning with George I in 1714, brought new tensions. The early Hanoverian kings were German-speaking and relied on ministers to govern. The rise of the office of Prime Minister, most notably Sir Robert Walpole, marked the beginning of cabinet government and the modern political system. Parliament became the center of power, and the two-party system of Whigs and Tories took shape. The 18th century was also a time of economic growth and innovation. The agricultural revolution transformed farming, increasing productivity and freeing labor for industry. The beginnings of the Industrial Revolution could be seen in the new factories, canals, and machines that appeared across the land. Trade and empire expanded, with British merchants and ships reaching every corner of the globe. Society was changing too. The middle class grew in wealth and influence, while the old aristocracy adapted to new realities. Cities grew rapidly, and the population increased. The arts flourished, with writers like Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift, Samuel Johnson, and Jane Austen creating works of lasting value. Science and invention advanced, with figures like James Watt, Joseph Priestley, and Edward Jenner making discoveries that would change the world. The Age of Reason and Enlightenment brought new ideas about government, rights, and the nature of society. Philosophers like John Locke and Adam Smith argued for liberty, property, and the free market. The American Revolution, inspired in part by British ideas, challenged the authority of the Crown and Parliament, leading to the loss of the American colonies, but also to new debates about representation and rights. The Glorious Revolution and the birth of constitutional monarchy were not just events in British history. They were milestones in the development of democracy and the rule of law. The principles established in this period, government by consent, the supremacy of Parliament, the protection of rights, would influence revolutions and constitutions around the world. The story of the United Kingdom is a story of change and continuity, of struggle and compromise, of a people who learned to balance liberty and order, tradition and innovation. The legacy of the Glorious Revolution endures in the institutions, laws, and values of modern Britain, and in the hope that government can be both strong and just, both stable and free. The dawn of the 18th century found the kingdoms of England and Scotland at a crossroads. For centuries, the two nations had been neighbors, rivals, and sometimes bitter enemies. They had fought wars, signed treaties, and shared a monarch since the union of the crowns in 1603, but they remained separate countries, each with its own parliament, laws, and church. Yet, the pressures of politics, economics, and security were drawing them closer together. The Act of Union of 1707 would create a new nation, the Kingdom of Great Britain, and set the stage for the rise of the British Empire. The union was not inevitable, nor was it universally popular. In Scotland, Many feared the loss of independence, the dominance of English interests, and the threat to their church and legal system. In England, there were concerns about security, especially after the Jacobite uprisings and the threat of French invasion. The Union was driven by a mixture of ambition, fear, and opportunity. The English wanted to secure the Protestant succession and prevent Scotland from allying with France. The Scots, facing economic hardship after the failure of the Darien scheme, a disastrous attempt to establish a colony in Panama, saw the Union as a way to gain access to English markets and the growing wealth of empire. The negotiations were complex and contentious. The Scottish Parliament debated fiercely, and there were riots in the streets of Edinburgh and Glasgow. But in 1707, the Act of Union was passed, creating a single parliament at Westminster and a united kingdom under one crown. Scotland retained its own legal and educational systems, and the Church of Scotland remained independent. But the two nations were now joined in a political and economic partnership that would shape their destinies for centuries. The Union brought both challenges and opportunities. In the early years, there was resistance and resentment, especially in the Highlands and among the Jacobites, who continued to support the exiled Stuart line. The Jacobite risings of 1715 and 1745, led by figures like the Old Pretender and Bonnie, Prince Charlie, sought to restore the Stuarts to the throne. The final defeat at Culloden in 1746 ended the dream of a Venetian Stuart restoration and brought harsh reprisals against the Highland clans. The wearing of tartan, the playing of bagpipes, and the carrying of arms were banned, and the old clan system was broken. Yet, the Union also brought prosperity and growth. Scotland's merchants, shipbuilders, and inventors played a vital role in the expansion of trade and industry. The Scottish Enlightenment, led by thinkers like David Hume, Adam Smith, and James Watt, made Edinburgh and Glasgow centers of learning, science, and innovation. The universities flourished, and Scottish engineers and scientists contributed to the Industrial Revolution that was transforming Britain and the world. The 18th century was a time of empire. British merchants and sailors traveled the globe, trading in sugar, tobacco, cotton, and slaves. The Royal Navy became the most powerful in the world, protecting trade routes and projecting British power to every continent. The East India Company established a foothold in India, while colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and Africa grew in wealth and importance. The British Empire was built on commerce, conquest, and colonization, but also on conflict and contradiction. The wealth of the empire brought prosperity to many, but it was also built on the exploitation of enslaved people, the displacement of indigenous populations, and the violence of war and rebellion. The American colonies, once the pride of the empire, became a source of crisis. Disputes over taxation, representation, and the rights of colonists led to growing unrest. The Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, and the battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of the American Revolution. The war was long and costly, and in 1783, Britain was forced to recognize the independence of the United States. The loss of the American colonies was a blow to British pride and power, but it also forced a rethinking of empire. Attention turned to India, Australia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the gradual emancipation of enslaved people in the empire were milestones in the struggle for justice and humanity. Though the legacy of slavery would endure at home, the Union and the empire brought change and challenge. The Industrial Revolution transformed the economy, society, and landscape of Britain. Factories, mines, and mills sprang up in cities and towns, drawing millions from the countryside. The population grew rapidly and urban. Life became the norm for many. The new industrial working class faced long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. Child labor, pollution, and disease were common. Yet, the era also saw the rise of reform movements, trade unions, abolitionists, and campaigners for political rights. The Great Reform Act of 1832 began the process of expanding the vote, and the Chartists demanded universal suffrage, secret ballots, and fair representation. The Union of England, Scotland, and later Ireland was not without tension. The Irish, who had been brought under English rule by conquest and colonization, faced discrimination, poverty, and the loss of land. The Act of Union of 1801 created the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, but it did not bring peace or equality. The Great Famine of the 1840s, caused by potato blight and made worse by government inaction, killed 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate. The struggle for Irish rights and independence would continue for generations, shaping the politics and identity of the United Kingdom. The 19th century was an age of empire, industry, and reform. Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901, became the symbol of a confident, expanding, and sometimes complacent Britain. The empire reached its greatest extent, ruling over 1/4 of the world's land and people. The sun never set on the British Empire, and London was the center of global finance, culture, and power. Yet, the empire was also a source of conflict and contradiction. Wars in India, Africa, and China, the suppression of uprisings, and the exploitation of resources and people raised questions about justice, morality, and the meaning of British identity. The rise of nationalism, both at home and abroad, challenged the unity of the kingdom and the legitimacy of empire. The Irish struggle for home rule, the demands of Scottish and Welsh identity, and the movements for independence in India, Africa, and the Caribbean would shape the 20th century. The story of the Act of Union and the rise of the British Empire is a story of ambition and achievement, but also of conflict, injustice, and change. It is a story of people who built, resisted, and reimagined the nation and the world. The legacy of this era is found in the institutions, laws, and values of the United Kingdom, in the diversity of its people, and in the global connections that continue to shape its destiny. The Union created a powerful state, but also a complex and sometimes fragile identity. The empire brought wealth and influence, but also responsibility and challenge. The story of the United Kingdom is a story of union and division, of empire and independence, of tradition and transformation, a story that continues to unfold in the lives of its people and the history of the world, the story of the United Kingdom. In the 18th and 19th centuries is, above all, the story of the Industrial Revolution. It is a story of invention and ambition, of cities rising and landscapes changing, of fortunes made and lives transformed. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain, and it would change not only the kingdom but the entire world. It was a time when the old rhythms of rural life gave way to the relentless pace of machines, when steam and coal powered a new age of progress and possibility, and when the hopes and hardships of millions were woven into the fabric of modern society. The roots of the Industrial Revolution lay in the changes of the previous centuries. The Agricultural Revolution had transformed farming, increasing productivity and freeing labor for other pursuits. Enclosure Acts had consolidated land, pushing many small farmers off their fields and into the growing towns. The population was rising, and with it, the demand for food, clothing, and goods. Britain's wealth from trade and empire provided capital for investment, and its political stability, legal system, and culture of innovation encouraged risk-taking and enterprise. The first great changes came in the textile industry. For centuries, cloth had been made by hand, spun, and woven in cottages and small workshops. But in the late 18th century, inventors such as James Hargreaves, Richard Arkwright, and Samuel Crompton created machines, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the spinning mule that could produce yarn and cloth faster and more cheaply than ever before. The power loom, invented by Edmund Cartwright, revolutionized weaving. Cotton, imported from the American South and India, became the fabric of the age. Mills sprang up along rivers, harnessing water power, and later, steam engines. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt, was the heart of the Industrial Revolution. It powered factories, mines, and locomotives, transforming the way people worked and traveled. Coal, mined from the hills of Wales, Yorkshire, and Scotland, fueled the engines and heated the homes of the nation. Iron and steel, produced in ever greater quantities, built the bridges, railways, and ships that connected the kingdom and the world. The landscape of Britain was transformed. Cities such as Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Glasgow grew at astonishing rates, their skylines filled with chimneys, cranes, and smokestacks. The countryside was crisscrossed with canals, railways, and roads. The old village life faded, replaced by the bustle and noise of urban industry. Life in the new industrial cities was both exciting and harsh. For many, the factories and mills offered the promise of work and wages, a chance to escape the poverty of the countryside. But the reality was often grim. Workers toiled long hours in dangerous conditions, for low pay and little security. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in mines and mills, crawling through narrow tunnels or tending machines. Housing was crowded and unsanitary, with families packed into tiny rooms, sharing water pumps and privies. Disease, cholera, typhus, tuberculosis was rampant, and life expectancy was low. Yet, the Industrial Revolution also brought hope and opportunity. Wages, though low, were often higher than in rural areas, and the chance for advancement was real. Skilled workers, engineers, machinists, foremen could rise to positions of responsibility. Entrepreneurs and inventors made fortunes, and a new middle class of merchants, professionals, and managers emerged. The culture of self-improvement, thrift, and hard work became the ideal of the age. The government and society struggled to keep pace with the changes. The old laws and customs were often inadequate for the new realities. The poor laws, designed for a rural society, failed to address the needs of the urban poor. The Corn Laws, which protected landowners by keeping food prices high, sparked protest and debate. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819, when cavalry charged a crowd demanding reform in Manchester, shocked the nation and fueled a movement for change. Reformers, writers, and activists called for better conditions, shorter hours, and the end of child labor. The Factory Acts, passed in the early 19th century, began to regulate working hours and improve safety. The Chartist movement demanded universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and fair representation. Trade unions grew in strength, organizing strikes and campaigns for workers' rights. The abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833 was a milestone in the struggle for justice and humanity, though the legacy of exploitation and racism would endure. The Industrial Revolution also brought advances in science, technology, and culture. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the Crystal Palace in London, showcased the inventions and achievements of the age: steam engines, telegraphs, sewing machines, and more. The railways connected towns and cities, making travel faster and cheaper. The penny post, the telegraph, and the newspaper revolutionized communication. Education expanded, with new schools, libraries, and universities. The arts flourished, with writers such as Charles Dickens, the Brontë sisters, and Thomas Hardy, chronicling the hopes and hardships of the age. Painters, musicians, and architects created works that reflected both the beauty and the challenges of industrial society. The Industrial Revolution was not without its critics. Writers such as William Blake and John Ruskin lamented the loss of nature, the ugliness of the new cities, and the alienation of modern life. The Romantic poets Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, and Keats celebrated the beauty of the countryside and the power of the imagination. The rise of socialism, inspired by thinkers like Robert Owen and Karl Marx, challenged the inequalities of capitalism and called for a new society based on cooperation and justice. The impact of the Industrial Revolution was global. British goods, technology, and ideas spread around the world. The empire expanded, fueled by the demand for raw materials and markets. The wealth of the nation grew, but so did the challenges: poverty, pollution, and the tensions of a changing world. The Irish famine of the 1840s, caused by potato blight and made worse by government inaction, killed 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate. The struggle for Irish rights and independence would continue, shaping the politics and identity of the United Kingdom. The Industrial Revolution changed the way people lived, worked, and thought. It created new opportunities and new dangers, new freedoms and new constraints. It was a time of hope and hardship, of progress and pain. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution is found in the cities, the railways, the laws, and the culture of modern Britain. It is a story of invention and ambition, of struggle and survival, of a people who built a new world from the ashes of the old. The 19th century in Britain is often remembered as the Victorian Age, a time of extraordinary change, ambition, and contradiction. It was an era that saw the United Kingdom rise to the height of its power, ruling over a vast empire that stretched across the globe. It was also a time of profound social, economic, and cultural transformation, as the forces unleashed by the First World War. Industrial Revolution continued to reshape every aspect of life. The reign of Queen Victoria, from 1837 to 1901, became a symbol of the age, a period of confidence, progress, and sometimes complacency, but also of anxiety, struggle, and reform. Victoria came to the throne as a young woman of 18, inheriting a kingdom that was already the most powerful and industrialized in the world. Her reign would last more than 60 years, making her the longest-serving monarch in British history until the reign of Elizabeth II. Victoria's image, serious, dignified, and devoted to duty, became the embodiment of the values of her time. She was a wife, mother, and widow, a symbol of stability in a world of rapid change. The Victorian era was marked by the expansion of the British Empire to its greatest extent. The phrase "the sun never sets on the British Empire" was not just a boast, but a reality. British rule extended to India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, large parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and beyond. The empire was built on trade, conquest, and colonization, but also on the ideals of civilization, progress, and the white man's burden. The wealth of the empire flowed into Britain, enriching merchants, bankers, and industrialists, and funding the construction of railways, ports, and cities around the world. Yet, The empire was also a source of conflict and contradiction. The conquest of India, completed after the defeat of the Mughal Empire and the suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, brought both riches and responsibility. The British Raj ruled over hundreds of millions of people, imposing new laws, systems of education, and economic structures. The exploitation of resources and people, the suppression of local cultures, and the violence of colonial rule left deep scars that are still felt today. In Africa, the scramble for Africa saw European powers carve up the continent, often with little regard for the people who lived there. The legacy of empire is complex, a story of achievement and oppression, of connection and conflict. At home, Victorian Britain was a land of contrasts. The cities grew ever larger, filled with factories, shops, and tenements. The middle class expanded, and new opportunities for wealth and advancement appeared. The Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851 showcased the wonders of industry and invention, drawing visitors from around the world. The railways connected towns and cities, making travel faster and cheaper. The telegraph and the penny post revolutionized communication. The arts flourished, with writers such as Charles Dickens, the Brontë sisters, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy, chronicling the hopes and hardships of the age. Painters, musicians, and architects created works that reflected both the beauty and the challenges of industrial society. Yet, beneath the surface, there was poverty, disease, and inequality. The slums of London, Manchester, and Liverpool were crowded and unsanitary, with families living in squalor. Child labor, long hours, and dangerous conditions were common in factories and mines. The poor laws, workhouses, and the harsh discipline of the age made life difficult for the most vulnerable. Reformers, philanthropists, and activists campaigned for change. The Factory Acts, the Mines Act, and the Public Health Acts began to improve conditions. The Chartist movement demanded political rights, and the Reform Acts gradually expanded the vote to more men. Women began to organize for their own rights, campaigning for education, property, and eventually, the right to vote. The Victorian era was also a time of scientific and technological progress. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution challenged traditional beliefs and sparked fierce debate. Michael Faraday, James Clerk Maxwell, and other scientists made discoveries that transformed understanding of electricity, magnetism, and the natural world. Medicine advanced with the development of anesthesia, antiseptics, and vaccines. Hospitals, schools, and libraries were built, and the idea of public service and civic duty became central to the Victorian ideal. Religion remained a powerful force, but it too was changing. The Church of England faced challenges from nonconformists, Catholics, and new religious movements. The Oxford movement sought to revive ancient rituals and traditions, while evangelical revivalists called for personal faith and social reform. Missionaries traveled the world, spreading Christianity and British values, but also encountering and sometimes undermining local cultures and beliefs. The Victorian family was idealized as a haven of love, order, and respectability. The roles of men and women were clearly defined, with men as breadwinners and women as wives and mothers. Yet, the reality was often more complex. Many women worked outside the home, in factories, shops, and as servants. The struggle for women's rights gained momentum, with figures like Florence Nightingale, Josephine Butler, and the suffragettes leading the way. Education for girls expanded, and women began to enter the professions. The political life of Victorian Britain was marked by stability and gradual reform. The two-party system of conservatives and liberals dominated Parliament. Prime ministers such as Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone debated the great issues of the day: reform, empire, Ireland, and the rights of the people. The monarchy, once threatened by revolution and scandal, became a symbol of national unity and pride. Victoria's golden and diamond jubilees were celebrated with parades, pageants, and public festivities. Ireland remained a source of conflict and sorrow. The Great Famine of the 1840s, caused by potato blight and made worse by government inaction, killed 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate. The struggle for Irish rights and independence continued, with movements for home rule, land reform, and cultural revival. The tensions between Catholics and Protestants, landlords and tenants, would shape the politics of the United Kingdom for generations. The Victorian era was also a time of anxiety and doubt. The pace of change, the challenges of urban life, and the uncertainties of empire created a sense of unease. The condition of England question, the debate about poverty, inequality, and the meaning of progress haunted writers, politicians, and reformers. The rise of socialism, trade unions, and new political movements challenged the old order. The Boer War at the end of the century exposed the limits of imperial power and the costs of conquest. Yet, the legacy of Victorian Britain is profound. The institutions, laws, and values of the age shaped the modern United Kingdom. The empire left a mark on the world, for good and ill. The achievements of science, industry, and culture continue to inspire. The struggles for rights, justice, and equality laid the foundations for the freedoms enjoyed today. The story of Victorian Britain is a story of ambition and anxiety, of hope and hardship, of a people who built a new world and faced its challenges with courage and creativity. The dawn of the 20th century found Britain at the height of its power. The empire stretched across the globe. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, and London was the financial and cultural capital of the world. The Victorian Age had given way to the Edwardian era, a time of elegance, confidence, and innovation. Yet, beneath the surface, there were tensions and anxiety, social unrest, demands for reform, the rise of new political movements, and the growing competition of other powers. The world was changing, and Britain would soon be drawn into a conflict that would test the nation as never before. The causes of the First World War were complex and deep-rooted. The great powers of Europe were locked in a web of alliances, rivalries, and ambitions. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, sought its place in the sun, challenging the dominance of Britain and France. Austria-Hungary and Russia vied for influence in the Balkans, while France sought revenge for its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Within weeks, Europe was at war. Britain was drawn into the conflict by its alliance with France and Russia, and by its commitment to defend Belgium's neutrality. The declaration of war in August 1914 was met with a wave of patriotism and enthusiasm. Men rushed to enlist, convinced that the war would be over by Christmas. Posters, songs, and speeches called on Britons to do their duty for king and country. The British Expeditionary Force was sent to France, joining the French and Belgian armies in the defense against the German advance. The reality of war was far different from the expectations. The fighting quickly bogged down into trench warfare, a brutal and deadly stalemate that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Soldiers lived and died in muddy, rat-infested trenches, facing constant danger from artillery, machine guns, gas attacks, and snipers. The great battles of the Western Front, Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, became symbols of sacrifice and suffering. The Battle of the Somme in 1916, intended to break the deadlock, resulted in more than 1 million casualties for a few miles of ground. The first day alone saw nearly 60,000 British casualties, the bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. The war was not confined to the trenches of France and Belgium. British forces fought in the Middle East, Africa, and the seas. The Royal Navy blockaded Germany, cutting off supplies and starving the enemy. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 was the largest naval battle of the war, with heavy losses on both sides, but no decisive victory. In the Middle East, British and Commonwealth troops fought the Ottoman Empire, capturing Jerusalem and Baghdad. The war also reached the home front. For the first time, civilians became targets. German Zeppelins and bombers attacked British cities, and the threat of submarine warfare endangered merchant ships. The government introduced rationing, conscription, and new controls over the economy and society. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, working in factories, farms, and offices. The suffragette movement, which had campaigned for women's right to vote, gained new momentum as women proved their value to the nation. The war brought hardship and sacrifice, but also a sense of unity and purpose. Communities rallied to support the troops, raising money, sending care packages, and caring for the wounded. The poetry and literature of the war by writers such as Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Vera Brittain captured the horror, the heroism, and the futility of the conflict. The war also brought new technologies, tanks, airplanes, machine guns, and poison gas that changed the nature of battle and the experience of those who fought. As the war dragged on, the initial enthusiasm faded, the losses mounted, and the hopes of a quick victory vanished. The Russian Revolution in 1917 brought new uncertainty as the Eastern Front collapsed and Germany was able to concentrate its forces in the West. The entry of the United States into the war in 1917 provided fresh troops and resources, tipping the balance in favor of the Allies. In 1918, a series of German offensives threatened to break through, but the Allies held firm. The 100 Days Offensive, led by British, French, and American forces, pushed the Germans back. On November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. The armistice was signed, and the war was over. The cost of victory was staggering. Nearly 1 million British soldiers had died, and millions more were wounded or missing. The empire had been shaken, its resources stretched, and its people traumatized. The war had changed everything: politics, society, culture, and the very sense of what it meant to be British. The old certainties were gone, replaced by doubt, grief, and a longing for peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany and redrew the map of Europe. The League of Nations was created in the hope of preventing future wars, but the seeds of new conflicts were already sown. At home, the war brought profound changes. The role of women in society was transformed as they gained the right to vote and new opportunities in work and education. The old class system was challenged as the shared experience of war broke down barriers and created a sense of common purpose. The economy struggled to recover, facing unemployment, strikes, and the challenges of rebuilding. The Irish question, long a source of conflict, erupted into violence and rebellion. The Easter Rising of 1916, though crushed, inspired a new generation of Irish nationalists. The Anglo-Irish War led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, dividing the island and leaving a legacy of tension and conflict. The war also changed the culture of Britain. The literature, art, and music of the post-war years reflected the trauma and disillusionment of a generation. The lost generation of writers and artists sought new forms of expression, questioning the values and assumptions of the past. The rise of radio, cinema, and popular music created new ways for people to connect and share their experiences. The memory of the war was kept alive in monuments, ceremonies, and the 2-minute silence on Armistice Day. The First World War was a turning point in the history of the United Kingdom. It marked the end of the old world and the beginning of the modern age. The empire would never be the same, and the hopes and dreams of a generation were forever changed. The story of Britain in World War I is a story of courage and sacrifice, of loss and resilience, of a people who endured the greatest test of their history and emerged determined to build a better world. The shadow of the First World War hung heavily over Britain as the 20th century moved forward. The nation had paid a terrible price for victory, and the hope that the Great War would be the war to end all wars soon faded. The 1920s and 1930s were years of recovery, uncertainty, and change. The empire was still vast, but its foundations were beginning to shift. The rise of new powers, the threat of fascism and communism, and the lingering wounds of the past created a world that was both hopeful and anxious. In this uncertain landscape, the United Kingdom would face its greatest test yet, World War. The seeds of the Second World War were sown in the aftermath of the First. The Treaty of Versailles, which ended World War, imposed harsh terms on Germany, fueling resentment and economic hardship. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the 1930s brought a new and terrifying ideology to power in Germany. Hitler's promises of national revival, his hatred of Jews and other minorities, and his dreams of conquest and empire threatened the peace of Europe. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's fascist regime sought to restore the glory of Rome, while in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin ruled with an iron fist. The world was divided, and the old order was crumbling. Britain, like much of Europe, was slow to recognize the danger. The horrors of the last war were still fresh, and many hoped that peace could be preserved through diplomacy and compromise. The policy of appeasement, championed by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, sought to avoid conflict by conceding to some of Hitler's demands. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, was hailed as a triumph of peace. Chamberlain returned to Britain, declaring peace for our time, but the peace was an illusion. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war. The world was once again plunged into conflict. The early months of the war, known as the Phony War, were marked by uncertainty and waiting. British and French forces prepared for battle, but little happened on the Western Front. In the spring of 1940, the German Blitzkrieg lightning war swept through Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and France. The British Expeditionary Force was forced to retreat to the beaches of Dunkirk, where a miraculous evacuation, known as Operation Dynamo, saved more than 300,000 soldiers. The fall of France left Britain alone against the Nazi war machine. The summer of 1940 brought the Battle of Britain, a desperate struggle for survival. The German Luftwaffe launched a massive bombing campaign, seeking to destroy the Royal Air Force and prepare for invasion. British pilots, many of them barely out of their teens, fought with courage and skill, defending the skies over southern England. The few, as they became known, turned the tide, and Hitler was forced to abandon his plans for invasion. The Blitz followed, as German bombers targeted London and other cities in a campaign of terror and destruction. Night after night, Families huddled in shelters and underground stations as bombs rained down. A city burned, but the spirit of the people did not break. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May 1940, rallied the nation with his words and his will. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Churchill's leadership, determination, and eloquence became a symbol of British resistance. The war was fought not only in the air and on the seas, but in the factories, fields, and homes of Britain. The entire nation was mobilized for total war. Men and women worked in munitions factories, built planes and tanks, grew food in victory gardens, and served as air raid wardens, nurses, and volunteers. Rationing, blackouts, and the constant threat of attack became part of daily life. Children were evacuated from the cities to the countryside, separated from their families for safety. The war brought hardship and sacrifice, but also a sense of unity and purpose. The Blitz spirit became legendary as communities came together to support one another. Britain was not alone. The Empire and the Commonwealth rallied to the cause. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and other lands fought alongside the British. The United States, at first neutral, became the arsenal of democracy, supplying weapons, food, and aid through the Lend-Lease program. In December 1941, after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, America entered the war, and the balance began to shift. The war was global, fought on every continent and in every ocean. British forces fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean, battling the armies of Germany and Italy. The campaign in North Africa, led by generals such as Bernard Montgomery and Erwin Rommel, became a test of strategy and endurance. The victory at El Alamein in 1942 marked a turning point as Allied forces began to push the Axis powers back. In the Atlantic, the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine fought a desperate battle against German U-boats, seeking to keep the lifelines of food and supplies open. The Battle of the Atlantic was long and costly, but the Allies eventually gained the upper hand. The war also brought new horrors. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others by the Nazis, shocked the conscience of the world. British and Allied soldiers who liberated the concentration camps were confronted with scenes of unimaginable suffering. The war was a struggle not only for territory, but for the very soul of humanity. In 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. British, American, Canadian, and other Allied troops stormed the beaches on D-Day, June 6, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. The fighting was fierce and costly, but the Allies advanced, liberating Paris, Brussels, and eventually reaching Germany. In the east, the Soviet Union pushed the Germans back, and the two armies met in the ruins of Berlin. Hitler committed suicide, and Germany surrendered in May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The conflict continued in the Pacific, where British and Commonwealth forces fought alongside the Americans against Japan. The war ended in August 1945, after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world was left in shock, and the age of nuclear weapons had begun. The cost of victory was immense. More than 400,000 Britons had died, and millions more were wounded, displaced, or bereaved. The cities of London, Coventry, Liverpool, and others were scarred by bombing. The economy was exhausted, and the empire was weakened. Yet, the war had also brought profound change. The experience of shared sacrifice created a new sense of unity and purpose. The Labour government, elected in 1945, promised to build a new society, a welfare state that would provide health care, education, and security for all. The National Health Service was created, and the foundations of the modern welfare state were laid. The war also marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. The demands of war, the rise of nationalism, and the changing world order led to the gradual dismantling of imperial rule. India, the jewel in the crown, gained independence in 1947, followed by Pakistan, Ceylon, and other colonies. The process of decolonization would continue for decades, reshaping the map of the world and the identity of Britain itself. The legacy of World War II is found in the memory of courage and sacrifice, in the monuments and cemeteries, in the stories of those who lived and died. It is found in the values of democracy, freedom, and human rights that were defended and affirmed. The war changed Britain forever, ending the age of empire and opening a new chapter in the story of the United Kingdom. The end of World War II marked a turning point in the history of the United Kingdom. The victory had come at a tremendous cost. Cities lay in ruins, the economy was exhausted, and millions of lives had been lost or changed forever. The empire that had once stretched across the globe was beginning to unravel, and the people of Britain faced the challenge of rebuilding their country and redefining their place in the world. The years that followed would see the creation of the welfare state, the end of empire, and the transformation of British society. In 1945, as the war ended, the Labour Party won a landslide victory in the general election. Clement Attlee became Prime Minister, promising to build a new Jerusalem, a fairer, more equal society for all. The Labour government set out to create a welfare state, a system that would provide security and opportunity from cradle to grave. The National Health Service was established in 1948, offering free health care to everyone, regardless of income. For the first time, ordinary people could see a doctor, receive treatment, and get medicine without fear of cost. The NHS became a symbol of national pride and compassion, and it remains one of the most cherished institutions in Britain. The welfare state was more than just health care. The government introduced family allowances, expanded education, built new schools and universities, and created a system of social security to protect against unemployment, sickness, and old age. Council houses were built to replace the slums destroyed by bombing, and millions of people moved into new, modern homes. The old class barriers began to break down, and the dream of a more equal society seemed within reach. The economy, however, faced enormous challenges. The war had left Britain deeply in debt, and the cost of rebuilding was immense. Rationing continued for years after the war, and shortages of food, fuel, and raw materials were common. The United States provided aid through the Marshall Plan, but the country had to adjust to a new reality. The days of imperial wealth and global dominance were over. The process of decolonization began in earnest. India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, gained independence in 1947, followed by Pakistan, Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, Burma, now Myanmar, and other colonies. The winds of change swept across Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia as former colonies demanded and won their freedom. The Suez Crisis of 1956, when Britain and France tried and failed to regain control of the Suez Canal from Egypt, marked the end of Britain's role as a global superpower. The loss of empire was both painful and liberating. For some, it was a source of nostalgia and regret. For others, a chance to build a new, more just relationship with the world. The Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of former colonies, became a symbol of cooperation and shared values. Immigration from the Commonwealth brought new cultures, languages, and traditions to Britain, transforming the face of the nation. The arrival of the Windrush generation from the Caribbean in 1948 marked the beginning of a new era of diversity and multiculturalism. The 1950s and 1960s were years of change and optimism. The economy recovered and living standards rose. The Festival of Britain in 1951 celebrated the nation's achievements and looked to the future. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953 was a moment of national pride, watched by millions on television. The welfare state expanded, and new opportunities opened for women, young people, and minorities. The arts flourished, with writers, musicians, and filmmakers creating works that captured the spirit of the age. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other bands led the British invasion of popular music, while writers like George Orwell, Doris Lessing, and Kingsley Amis explored the hopes and anxieties of post-war society. Yet, the years of optimism were also years of challenge. The old industries, coal, steel, shipbuilding began to decline, and unemployment rose in the North and the Midlands. Strikes, protests, and social unrest became common. The struggle for civil rights, equality, and justice continued as women, minorities, and the LGBTQ+ community demanded recognition and respect. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, a conflict rooted in history, religion, and identity, brought violence and division to the United Kingdom. Bombings, shootings, and riots scarred the cities of Belfast, Londonderry, and beyond. The search for peace would take decades, but the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 would finally bring hope for reconciliation. The welfare state itself faced new pressures. The cost of health care, education, and social security rose, and debates about reform, efficiency, and fairness became central to politics. The conservative governments of Margaret Thatcher and John Major in the 1980s and 1990s sought to reduce the role of the state, privatize industries, and promote individual responsibility. The Labour governments of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the 2000s tried to balance reform with investment in public services. The debate about the future of the welfare state continues to this day. Britain's place in the world was also changing. The country joined the European Economic Community in 1973. Later, the European Union, seeking to rebuild its economy and influence through partnership with its neighbors. The relationship with Europe was always complex and contested, and the decision to leave the EU in the Brexit referendum of 2016 marked a new chapter in the nation's story. The process of decolonization, immigration, and globalization transformed British society. The United Kingdom became a nation of many cultures, languages, and identities. The old certainties of class, religion, and empire gave way to new questions about who the British were and what they wanted to become. The story of post-war Britain is a story of resilience and adaptation, of hope and disappointment, of struggle and achievement. It is the story of a people who rebuilt their country from the ruins of war, created a welfare state that became a model for the world, and faced the challenges of a changing, interconnected globe. The legacy of this era is found in the institutions, values, and diversity of modern Britain, and in the ongoing search for justice, equality, and belonging. The story of the United Kingdom in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is a story of transformation, challenge, and resilience. The empire that once spanned the globe has faded into history, but the legacy of that empire and the experiences of war, peace, and social change continued to shape the nation. The modern United Kingdom is a place of diversity and dynamism, of tradition and innovation, of debate and reinvention. It is a country that has faced the end of empire, the rise of new identities, and the challenges of a rapidly changing world. Yet has found ways to adapt, endure, and influence far beyond its shores. In the decades after World War II, Britain rebuilt itself from the ruins of conflict. The welfare state, created in the 1940s, provided health care, education, and social security for all. The National Health Service became a symbol of compassion and equality, and the expansion of education opened new opportunities for millions. The arts flourished, with British writers, musicians, and filmmakers gaining global recognition. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and other bands led a musical revolution, while writers like J.K. Rowling, Salman Rushdie, and Zadie Smith brought new voices and stories to the world. British cinema, from James Bond to Harry Potter, became a global phenomenon. The United Kingdom became a more open and diverse society. Immigration from the Commonwealth and beyond brought new cultures, languages, and traditions. London, Birmingham, Manchester, and other cities became vibrant centers of multicultural life. The Notting Hill Carnival, the Diwali celebrations, and Chinese New Year parades reflected the changing face of the nation. The Windrush generation, arriving from the Caribbean in the late 1940s and 1950s, played a vital role in rebuilding the country and enriching its culture. Later waves of immigrants from South Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe added to the tapestry of British life. The struggle for equality and justice continued. The civil rights movement, inspired by events in the United States, challenged discrimination and demanded change. The Race Relations Acts of the 1960s and 1970s outlawed discrimination and promoted integration. The women's movement fought for equal pay, reproductive rights, and representation in politics and business. The LGBTQ community campaigned for recognition, dignity, and the right to love and marry. The Disability Discrimination Act and other reforms sought to create a more inclusive society. The journey was not always smooth. There were riots, protests, and setbacks, but the direction was clear. The United Kingdom also faced challenges to its unity and identity. The Troubles in Northern Ireland, a conflict rooted in history, religion, and politics, brought decades of violence and division. Bombings, shootings, and riots scarred the cities of Belfast, Londonderry, and beyond. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998, achieved through negotiation and compromise, brought hope for peace and reconciliation, though tensions remain. In Scotland and Wales, the rise of nationalism led to the creation of devolved parliaments and governments, giving new powers and voices to the nations of the UK. The question of Scottish independence remains a live issue, debated in parliaments, and pubs, in homes, and on the streets. The economy of the United Kingdom has changed dramatically. The old industries of coal, steel, and shipbuilding have declined, replaced by finance, technology, and the creative industries. London is a global financial center, but the gap between rich and poor, north and south, remains a challenge. The 2008 financial crisis, austerity policies, and the impact of globalization have tested the resilience of communities and the social fabric of the nation. The COVID-19 pandemic brought new hardships, but also revealed the strength and compassion of the NHS, key workers, and ordinary people. Britain's relationship with Europe has been a source of debate and division. The decision to join the European Economic Community in 1973 was seen as a way to rebuild the economy and strengthen ties with neighbors. Yet, the relationship was always complex, marked by debates over sovereignty, identity, and the future. The Brexit referendum of 2016, in which a majority voted to leave the European Union, marked a new chapter in the nation's story. The process of leaving the EU was long and contentious, dividing families, communities, and political parties. The consequences of Brexit are still unfolding, shaping trade, immigration, and the very idea of what it means to be British. The monarchy remains a symbol of continuity and tradition. Queen Elizabeth II, who reigned from 1952 to 2022, became the longest-serving monarch in British history. Her life spanned eras of war and peace, empire and independence, change and stability. The royal family, with its triumphs and scandals, continues to fascinate and divide opinion. The coronation of King Charles III marked the beginning of a new era, as the monarchy adapts to the challenges and expectations of the modern world. The United Kingdom is a leader in science, technology, and innovation. British scientists have made breakthroughs in medicine, genetics, and climate research. The country is at the forefront of the fight against climate change, investing in renewable energy, conservation, and sustainable development. The creative industries, film, music, fashion, design, are global leaders, shaping trends and tastes around the world. British universities attract students from every continent, and the English language is a passport to opportunity and connection. Sport is a source of pride and unity. Football, rugby, cricket, and tennis bring people together, from local parks to Wembley Stadium and Wimbledon. The London Olympics of 2012 showcased the nation's talent, diversity, and spirit. The arts, from Shakespeare to Stormzy, from Turner to Tracy Emin, continue to inspire and challenge. The United Kingdom is also a nation of debate and democracy. The House of Commons and the House of Lords, the courts and the press, the traditions of free speech and protest, all play a role in shaping the nation's life. The challenges of the 21st century: climate change, inequality, migration, security are debated in Parliament, in the media, and in the streets. The country faces questions about its future, its values, and its place in the world. Yet, the story of the United Kingdom is one of resilience and reinvention. From the days of empire to the challenges of Brexit, from the struggles for rights and justice to the celebrations of culture and community, the nation has found ways to adapt, endure, and thrive. The legacy of centuries of history is found in the diversity of its people, the strength of its institutions, and the creativity of its culture. The modern United Kingdom is a place of hope and challenge, of memory and possibility. It is a nation that honors its past but looks to the future, that values tradition, that embraces change, that welcomes the world but seeks to define its own path. The story of Britain is far from over. It is a story that continues to unfold, written by the millions who call these islands home, and by the generations yet to come.